So yes, my name is Sophie Bertrand, and I had the chance, in fact, to realize already a few biodiversity audits of EuroDairy Pilot Farm, and that was a really interesting experience. And I will give you some results during my presentation after the principles. So as an introduction, I would say that the diversity of habitats, species, crops, varieties, and livestock breeds is what, in fact, is a cornerstone of dairy farming in Europe, with many wild species being reliant upon European dairy farmland. But scientific data are needed to enable us to evaluate the impact of different dairy farming systems on the state of European biodiversity, and also more the point to enable us to design recommendation to dairy farmers. And that's what we are trying to do, in fact, within this EuroDairy project. But so to start with, the first question is, what is biodiversity? I will start by like the official definition, which is a UN definition. So biodiversity is the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and all the aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. And this includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So that's a bit complicated definition. I also give you like in very simple terms this definition of biodiversity, which is that biological diversity is in fact the living part of nature, the living in its diversity and complexity. And more the point regarding agriculture, which is our issue, agriculture with all its varieties of plants and animals is in fact fully integrated into what we call biodiversity. So that was for the definition. Now I need to explain a bit biodiversity because in fact there is like two main types of biodiversity. To start with, there is what we call the ordinary biodiversity, which we are going to talk a lot during this presentation. And in fact, the ordinary biodiversity has no intrinsic value identified as such, but the abundance and the multiple interactions among its entities contribute to the functioning of ecosystems and production. So again, it is a bit complicated definition. I just illustrate that by the next slide, where you can see like on the photo here is like the normal landscape that you can see around you when you're traveling. And that's what we call in fact the ordinary biodiversity. And that is in opposition to what we call the highlights or the extraordinary biodiversity, which mean like the protected species, wild species that are in danger. So that is the main difference between the two diversity. And to end up with all the definition, I also want to give you the definition of agroecological infrastructure, because we are going to talk a lot about it today. So in fact, that is semi-natural habitats, you can call that as well. And the definition is that is stationary paths of the landscape that are both useful and productive, providing many services like reducing reliance on pesticide, soil stability, and everything. And so, in fact, again, in simple terms, that's what we call trees, hedgerows, stone walls. That's what we call semi-natural habitats on the farm. And they are a very important part of biodiversity. So that was for the extraordinary biodiversity. Now, regarding especially dairy and biodiversity, the second important question is, why is biodiversity important for dairy farming? In fact, it is important because farmland biodiversity is actually the basis for agricultural activities, like any farming system use soil, plants, microorganisms. And on top of that, agriculture production benefits from the wild species on the farm. And I want to illustrate that by an example in the US that you can see here, where you had they had a decline of the bats in the US, and they calculate that it could be worth 3.7 billion to the agricultural sector, just because in fact bats during the night they eat all the insects that can make damage on the crops. And because of the decline of the bats, the farmers had to buy pesticides, and it cost a lot of money. That is just an example of what we call agricultural production benefits from the wild species on farm. And the second reason why biodiversity is important for dairy farming is also that biodiversity boosts productivity. There is already a few studies that shows the link between a higher productivity level on the farm and the biodiversity level. But that's also something we want to demonstrate within EuroDairy, because the pilot farms that have been audited for biodiversity also gave us their economic results, and the idea is to make the link between their economic results and the state of biodiversity of the farm. And we are confident to find a link between the economic results and the biodiversity level. And now to take a step back and try to have a global view regarding biodiversity and dairy, what are the main challenges? The main global challenges is that, in fact, there is a global need to balance productivity with maintenance of biodiversity. And what I mean by that is that the world needs milk. So dairy farmers need to produce milk efficiency. They have to produce that in an efficient way, but they also need to maintenance biodiversity. And sometimes there is a contradiction between the high productive farming system and the maintenance of biodiversity. So the challenge is to try and find the balance between the two. Now, regarding specifically within the dairy sector, in fact, we have a really wide range of landscape in Europe, a wide range of production systems, localized environmental drivers, and so the impact on biodiversity of the same practices could be either positive or negative, depending on the intensity of the production, the practices, the local condition, the climate, and everything. So it's all extremely complex, and there is no simple recommendation. And just to illustrate this complexity, I show you the result of a study on birds' response to intensity that show again that there is no single response. Like you can see on the graph on the left-hand side, a link between the intensity of the production here and the effect on the queenfish population abundance. And you can see that obviously this bird like productive area because you have an increase of the population of the bird while increasing the intensity of the production. But on the contrary, in the same field, you can see that there is a decrease of the population of the buzzard abundance because this bird doesn't like intensity. So you have a response which is different depending on your practices and depending what you select, in fact. So that goes for the challenges. Now, again, to stay at the very general level, what are the main global principles around biodiversity? The first main key principle is that biodiversity is very complex, it is multivariate, and extremely context dependent. So assessment of dairy impact on biodiversity is very complicated. The second key principle is that the action plan, or what we can call also the level of action, should identify action at the same time at habitats level and species level. And I'm going to explain that in detail later in my presentation. The third key principle is also that we need to reflect positive and negative impact on the farm to try and make sure that you can correct when it's possible. And also you have to reflect direct and indirect impacts of farm. So what I mean by that is, for example, you can have a very nice small dairy farm in Europe with 100% of permanent pasture, which is very good for the biodiversity of the region. But this farm does not produce enough feed for the cows, so the farmer has to buy soya from Brazil. And the soya can be grown on very intensive crop fields on like deforested area, so which is very bad for biodiversity in Brazil. And in total at the world level, that situation does not make sense. So that's what we want to avoid. And the last principle is also that you need to choose a reference state, what I call a baseline for comparison, because for biodiversity, you can't assess a dairy farm only on its own. It has to be included and compared within the region, otherwise it doesn't make sense either. So that was for the principles. Now, based on these very big principles, we've built some criteria that has been used for the biodiversity audits on dairy farm within the EuroDairy project. And these criteria are regional land use and farm land use. So the idea, in fact, is shown on this map here. The idea is to try and compare the land use mosaic on the farm to the land use mosaic of the region to see whether the farm improves the landscape of the region or not, allowing the movement and displacement of little animals, in fact. The other criteria that have been used for the audit is also the farm spatial organization of seminatural habitats. We did a mapping of all the seminatural habitats of the farm. Another criteria that have been used is management of parent grassland, because it's important for biodiversity. And the last criteria was whether the farm is included within a protected area or not. So that's to be also taken into account. So these criteria, in fact, are based on what we call the three components of biodiversity on a dairy farm. And so these three components are shown here. That's the mosaic effect, the agricultural structures, and the grassland management, because dairy farm land biodiversity is determined by these three main components, and I'm going to detail what it means. To start with, the first component is the mosaic effect. By the mosaic effect, we mean that heterogeneity of farming landscape is positive for biodiversity. Like you can see the illustration here, if you have 20 hectares of just corn and maize, that's not very good for biodiversity. While if you have the same areas, but with 5 hectares of maize, 10 hectares of barley, 5 hectares of grassland, that's a lot better, because that increases the complexity and the diversity of the area, and that increase what we call specific biodiversity. And what I mean by that, so it doesn't mean that you have more animals on the second field. It's not a question of abundance, but it means that you have more different species, different varieties, which is as important as the abundance of the animals. That is another example to illustrate the mosaic effect. So this graph shows that the heterogeneity leverage trade-off in biodiversity and production. So you can see a link on this graph between the herbage production intensity and the bird population. As expected, while you increase your herbage production, you can see a decline in the bird numbers. But if you look at one type of dairy farming system with the same intensity of production, the farming system with a very low population of bird has like a non-very diverse landscape on the farm, while the farming system with the same intensity, who has more birds on his farm, has a very diverse mosaic landscape on the farm. So that's another example to show that the mosaic effect is positive for biodiversity. The second component is seminatural habitats, because we've shown a strong relation between the abundance of species and the percentage of seminatural elements of the farm. And that is shown on these two graphs, where you can see a link between the seminatural elements percentage on the farm here and the numbers of species of birds here and the numbers of insects here. So there is a strong relation between the natural elements and the abundance of species. That's why they're important. And this slide is just to illustrate what are semi-natural habitats. Like it can be hedges, walls, riverine woodland, creeks, and so on, rivers. And what is also good with this semi-natural habitats is that they also produce co-benefits for the farm, like they can limit erosion, they can do water recreation, and so on. So it's like win-win partnership for the farm. The third component is grassland management, because grasslands are the most species-rich vegetation types. You can find up to 80 plant species per square meter on grassland, which is huge. But grazing practices and fertilization practices influence the biodiversity state on the grassland. So that's why the agroecological value is limited if the grassland is intensively grazed or receive more than, we would say, 80 units of mineral fertilizer per hectare. So that was for all the different big principles around biodiversity. Now I will just try and illustrate all that with a few examples of the biodiversity audits that have been already realized. And I start with the farm number one, which was very interesting, and I explained why. Actually, on this farm, the farmland use was very favorable to biodiversity because 100% of the farm was in permanent pasture. So you would say a permanent pasture is not like a mosaic diversity because it's just one crop, but it has been demonstrated that permanent pasture is as good as like a very diverse mosaic landscape. So that is favorable for biodiversity anyway. The second point of the audit was about seminatural habitats. And you can see on this farm that it is very favorable for semi-natural habitats because in fact the farm has a very large surfaces of semi-natural habitats, especially due to this kind of hedges that you can see on the photo here. You had hedges around almost each field, which at the end make a very large volume of hedges, which is very good for biodiversity. So that's why it was favorable. And the third point of the audit was about grassland management. And on this farm, the farmer had a very intensive grassland management on the field. But we can say that this intensive management in the field is compensated by a very favorable farmland use and a very favorable farm habitats in semi-natural habitats. So I would say that the farmer find a way to balance his intensive management on grassland. The second farm was different way to find a trade-off. Same than the first one, the farmland use was very favorable again because this farm has the total surface in permanent pasture, which is always good for landscape biodiversity. But regarding semi-natural habitats, the impact of the farm was neutral because it didn't have so many hedges actually. You can see on the photos, it had that kind of small hedges and not a lot. So in total on the farm, that didn't represent a lot of habitat for the biodiversity. Then regarding the permanent grassland, you also had an intensive management of the grassland on the field to try and make the best of the grass, which is understandable. But to compensate these 2 points that are neutral to unfavorable to biodiversity, he had on the farm an area of grassland that was situated in a protected coastal area, which is a very variable specific area. And so it just had very extensive wet pasture with heifers on it, which is extremely good for biodiversity. And that is a way to compensate, I would say, the intensive management of the grassland and also the lack of semi-natural habitats on the farm. The farm 3 was again different. So this time, the farmland use was neutral because the landscape diversity on the farm, so the mosaic diversity of the farm was equivalent to the mosaic diversity of the region, so it's like neutral impact. He had also a natural surfaces of seminatural habitats because he had a few hedges, but not so many around the fields. So there was not so much habitats on the farm. But the impact was still natural because he managed to build a wild bird cover with the help of the Wild Bird Association of the region. And because of this wild bird cover, it compensates, in fact, the lack of seminatural habitats on the farm. And that is a very interesting cooperation, I think. And on the farm, regarding grassland, we also had an intensive grassland management on the main area of the farm, but he also had extensive pasture along the river where he put in heifers and no fertilizer and nothing. And this area of extensive pasture compensate for the intensive management of the main area. So that is again another way to balance on the farm productivity with maintenance of biodiversity. So you can see already with this example that each farm has his specific way and his specific level of action to maintain biodiversity, which is very, very interesting. So at this stage, my recommendation would be very simple. Regarding the landscape diversity, biodiversity can be enhanced by increasing landscape heterogeneity. Regarding seminatural habitats, the agroecological elements offer shelter possibilities, so biodiversity can be enhanced by increasing the number and diversity of seminatural habitats on the farm. And regarding grassland, grassland is an important factor for biodiversity. And keeping some grazing pasture with low fertilizer input, like for heifers, for example, can compensate the intensive grassland areas on the farm. But having said that, it is necessary to design different solutions for different systems because they are all very context dependent. And I could notice that because I had the chance to look at audits in Finland, Ireland, Denmark, and they all have a very different context. Like in Finland, the farms are surrounded by woodland, so you are not going to tell the farmer to plant trees or hedges because there is enough trees around the farm, which is not the case in Ireland. And in Denmark, they have another context, right? There is no hedges, not so many trees, but there is a lot of protected area, and the farmer help to preserve this protected area, which is another way to maintain biodiversity. So it's all dependent of the context. I would like to highlight as well as conclusions that pollution reduction will also benefit biodiversity. So it's good to say. And very importantly, factors such as raising knowledge about biodiversity may be in fact just as important for protecting biodiversity. And so that's all I had to say on this issue, but I'm very happy to answer your questions if you have some. So on the last slide, you can see my emails, and please send me your question. I will be very happy to answer you. And thank you very much for your attention.